Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I am super excited to be joined by Maria Cantacuzino. Hi, Maria. How are you? Marina, how are you?
Hi, I'm absolutely fine. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from London. Lovely day. And it's really such an honor to be on your podcast.
Thank you, Marina. And after all my worries about mispronouncing your surname, instead I mispronounce your first. Apologies for that. And thanks for joining me from London. It's pretty nice here too. And I'm so excited to talk to you about forgiveness today because we haven't really focused on it too much so far in this podcast.
Mm.
But before we get into forgiveness, Marina, can you tell me a bit about yourself and your background, please?
Yeah, my background is in journalism. I started off actually as a television researcher, and then I went to work for the Telegraph magazine. Didn't last very long. That was in London. Had, in the course of 8 years, 3 children, and decided to go freelance. And actually, for about 15 years, I worked as a freelance journalist as the main breadwinner. My husband was a house husband, and I'm amazed to think that I actually achieved that because I don't think rates have gone up, since I was doing that in the 90s. But I did, and I had a fantastic time. Did a lot of work with the Red Cross, with Oxfam. I did a lot of traveling. I was a feature writer, and I loved what I did. But then I created an exhibition called the F Word Exhibition, Stories of Forgiveness, thinking my life would go back to journalism.
Okay.
But the interest in this exhibition was so phenomenal, this was in 2004, that I founded a charity called the Forgiveness Project. And while I'm not the director of the charity anymore, because I think founders need to step away at some point, I'm still intimately connected with it. And it is, it's in my lifeblood, really. And I've written 3 books, and the latest book has just come out called Forgiveness and Exploration, which I think is the sort of sum total of all I've learned so far about what forgiveness is and what it isn't.
Okay. Thanks, Marina. And so what prompted you then, I suppose, after the exhibition, what prompted you to set up the Forgiveness Project?
Well, the exhibition was prompted really by the Iraq War, which
Okay.
was I saw as what really was an act of revenge for 9/11. And as a journalist doing this traveling with Red Cross and Oxfam and working very closely with a photographer across many areas of my work, I just thought, let's try and collect different stories that have an emphasis on compassion, empathy, and forgiveness, because the language at that time spoken by politicians and repeated in the media was so bellicose. It was so much around tit for tat and payback and retaliation. I wanted to find stories which were countercultural in a way, which showed a different approach to violence. So we found, in our travels, I researched it and contacted people. It was a private project, it wasn't paid for. I had no idea where it was going, but I've just had this need to find these stories. And I searched them out over the course of a year, 26 stories from victims and survivors of violence and atrocity and crime who had not gone down the revenge route, whatever that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And I also spoke and interviewed, and the photographer photographed them, former perpetrators of violence and crime who could explain how they transformed their aggression into a force for peace. And this was then funded by Anita Roddick. These stories were funded to be an exhibition by Anita Roddick. And that was launched in January 2004 in the Oxo Gallery in London.
Okay.
And as I said, was phenomenally successful.
Mm.
And it was that actually that prompted me, because many of the storytellers, the people whose stories I'd shared, people with lived experience, had come to the launch. And they were saying, you must do something more than this. And people were saying, we want to use these stories for our own work in conflict resolution. And I just felt at that point, I need to do something more with this. And I was encouraged, again, largely by Anita Roddick as well, to start a charity using the stories. and trying to create a different narrative in the world, really, with my background in journalism. That's the approach I took. This was about storytelling.
Yeah. Thank you, Marina. And so from your professional experience leading up to that point and after that point, including the writing of the book you mentioned, Forgiveness and Exploration, and your other books, and then you also host the F Word podcast. What are some of the main lessons you have learned?
I think the first thing to say, and maybe I didn't expect this when I set off rather naively, was the complexity around the word forgiveness. I thought it was this place you kind of arrived at where everything was fixed and mended.
Right.
I didn't realize that it was multi-layered, multi-dimensional, easily misunderstood, open to interpretation, not always welcome, and not always appropriate. So it was contested and contentious territory. People could not agree on a definition. Whole books have been written about what it means, what it doesn't mean. There's conditional forgiveness, which depends on apology and remorse and is relational. There's unconditional forgiveness, which some people believe is true forgiveness because you're not expecting anything from the other, and it's an act of self-healing and self-preservation. So it was kind of a fascinating journey of discovery that I learned how complex forgiveness was. And I wanted to bring out those complexities because people have so much misunderstanding around this word, I think. And I didn't realize what a dirty word it was, in a way, that some people felt very affronted by it, or they felt it was weak or passive or lame. Even today, you know, the book is called Forgiveness and Exploration, and you know, I've reflected on the fact that many of my lovely friends have bought it because they're very supportive of me, but very few have read it.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I think
that's interesting.
You know, even though I think it's very, I mean, those who do say, oh, it's so readable, you know, and you know, some even say I couldn't put it down, and I think as a journalist, I have made it very accessible. But it puts people off in some way. They have so many. It's a word that Marion Partington, who's one of the storytellers, whose sister was killed by Fred and Rosemary West, the serial killers, and has written an amazing book which grapples with forgiveness herself. She says forgiveness is barnacled by eons of piety. And I think it is. There's this assumption that it's religious, that it's mystical, that it's without, you know, not always within reach, and for someone else, and weak, you know, as I said before, passive and weak. So these are the things that I've learned. I also learned that pain is the great motivator to forgive, and that when people are able to forgive, and often you can forgive one day and something can happen you might hate the next day. It's not a constant. But it relieves them of pain. It makes people feel better, and they often describe it in terms of physical and mental abilities. And sometimes they talk about life 1 and life 2. Life 1 being before, you know, when the pain or the violence or the trauma was inflicted on them, and not being able to cope with that, and trying to find strategies. And then finding a route through to forgiveness, whatever that means for them, has enabled them to live again, the second, not the same life, another life. And people talk also about, in terms of it empowering them, giving them the strength back, taking back control of their lives. That's a very constant theme as well, for how people describe forgiveness. Some talk about it being connected with reconciliation, but they are two very different things. But, you know, to forgive can lead to a reconciliation with a broken relationship. And yeah, I mean, those are the main things. And I just had never realized what a complex subject it was.
It's interesting for sure, the kind of the pious pushback maybe that some people felt, or that might be a barrier to grappling with the subject for some. I'm just wondering as well, did you find any gendered dimension to people's capacity to forgive? For example, you mentioned it being weak maybe, or passive. Might forgiveness be more associated with women who are also sometimes viewed as more emotional or more in touch with emotions? And you know, are there equal contributors, you know, male and female, or are more of the perpetrators male and the victims and people who go on the quest to forgive female? I'm just wondering, what was that thing that came through?
No, it's a good question. And in my research and in my, it's so anecdotal, yes, I've talked to many, many people, but you can't draw out any, because I would say there is no difference. But when I look at the research, yes, there is a difference. And you're absolutely right. Because there is a sense of vulnerability associated with forgiveness, and women are more comfortable with vulnerability. And because forgiveness is seen as a weakness by many, and because men are more drawn towards accountability and justice, and because women are invested in creating and keeping better relationships, and because women tend to be more religious, that means that, yes, not hugely, but overall women, research has shown, tend to be more forgiving than men.
Interesting. Because of course, while I'm sure, in human behavior, certainly in terms of gender-based violence, domestic violence within the home, homicides, many are perpetrated by men, unfortunately. Most probably are, but women can do things for which they could use forgiveness too, so were there also stories told about maybe people forgiving their parents for childhood trauma, or where the perpetrator, the abuser, had been a female?
In the stories that I've collected, yes, there have been, but they tend to have been, I'm thinking of Marina Cantacuzino again with Fred and Rosemary West, where husband and wife team, killed many women, young women. But Marina Cantacuzino, Fred West committed suicide in prison. So Marina Cantacuzino's journey, if you like, is all about forgiving Rosemary West. And she actually wrote to her at one point when she felt ready, years later, to offer her forgiveness, but the letter was returned. And she said she had only sent it when she knew she didn't need a response. But her ability to forgive Rosemary West rested entirely on her hearing the testimony in court, where it became very clear to her that here was a woman who was so impoverished in her heart and had been so badly damaged as a child that she was incapable of not repeating what had been done for her. And through that understanding, Marion came to line herself up for forgiveness. That's how she puts it, and I quite like that, because it can be a sort of decisional, something people make a choice to do. Not always. Sometimes it's spontaneous and comes instinctively and immediately, but very often it's a conscious decision.
Yes. And obviously, like that case, I remember it well as a child. We had a shop and I used to read, the horrendous, grisly, it was mind-boggling, really. And the number of young girls and women who came to a brutal end at the hands of those two people. Very hard to forgive something like that. I mean, not all acts of wrongdoing are equal in one sense. Some acts or omissions are harder, I would think, to forgive.
Yes.
So you've given me some information there, including the lady who lined herself up for forgiveness. But how and why do people strive to reach forgiveness? Because it is a kind of a journey, as you say. It's not a final destination necessarily. It's not maybe I've forgiven X person and now there will be no more anger or rage or grief in my heart. But is it partly that quest for, you say it's grounded initially in pain?
Yeah, I think it's always grounded in pain. It's pain is the great motivator to forgive, because people can feel worn down. If you don't forgive, and there are good reasons not to forgive, and I want to stress that I'm not saying people should forgive.
Yeah.
That's a very violent word, should. But if you don't, there is a tendency to ruminate and to keep thinking and to keep to become locked in the story of what happened. And sometimes people find that wearing and intrusive, and the repetitive thoughts are there the whole time. And one way that they explore it, sometimes, it happens for all sorts of reasons, it seems. Somebody can say something and in an instant you think something differently. Something can happen to you, or you just become exhausted with feeling bad about yourself and what happened and unable to go forward. And so people think, what does forgiveness look like? And forgiveness is about letting go to a point. So in a way, not forgetting, but being able to free up those memories. So in a way, they're like in a cage in your mind. They're not gone, they'll never go, but you don't revisit them the whole time. In fact, Desmond Tutu talked about it, taking the sting out of the memory that threatens to poison your entire existence. He says it's not about forgetting, but it's about taking the sting out of the memory. So that's one reason. And I think some people have a, Figan Murray is a good example, I think. Her son was killed in the Manchester Arena bombings.
Okay.
He was in his 20s, and she had always thought forgiveness was irrelevant. She never thought about it before. And for the first 2 weeks, while she was dealing with the shock and the grief, she didn't think about it. But then she saw some newspaper. I won't go into what it was, but it was very moving what she saw in the newspaper about another attack, terrorist attack. And she suddenly realized that she had to embrace forgiveness for those who'd done this to her son and to others, because she needed to put out into the world those values that had been so lacking when her son was killed. So all the opposite values, to hate, division, prejudice, all the opposite values to what makes a violent extremist. And that meant compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. And from that moment on, she has lived her life with those values. And sometimes she's quite isolated because of it. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes she's not understood. But that's another reason people absolutely intent in not hating like the hater. The hater being the person who's hurt you, whatever that is, whether it's with the family or something big like a terrorist attack. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. Actually, it was Margot van Sluytman who recommended that I speak to you. And Margot, of course, lost her father in violent circumstances as a girl and grappled with the loss and rage and grief, and then got to know the man who killed him, and then experienced kind of difficulties with her family of origin because of that relationship that she built. And I've also met Joe Berry, who was on your website too, the Forgiveness Project. I've had dinner with her. I've never actually heard her speak, but I've been told it's phenomenally moving. And she also lost her dad in the Brighton bombing and met the perpetrator and built a relationship. My last interview last week was with a woman called Lynn Harris, whose father murdered her mother in front of her as a child, as a 14-year-old. And she and her sister, towards the end of his life when he was in prison, chose the route of forgiveness. They felt they had to meet him and kind of be reconciled to a degree. So in the 1.5 years before he died of cancer, did forgive him. Now, Lynn was prompted by being a member of a church. She joined a church in order to navigate through her pain, in fact, actually. And it was then through that she moved into thinking about forgiveness to free herself from the agony, I guess. Is it common that people do actually want to meet the perpetrators?
Well, I think if you're talking about people who have lined themselves up for forgiveness, if you like, then probably it's, I mean, I don't know if it's common, but it's certainly, it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason is what forgiveness is more than letting go and accepting. It's both of those things, but it also must include a degree of empathy and compassion, even if it's a tiny amount, for the person who's harmed you. And therefore, the humanizing of the enemy of that is part of it. And sometimes that is done through meeting face to face, not always. I worked with a woman whose young daughter, teenage daughter, was killed by another young woman, you know, going back to actually what you asked before. She wrote to the perpetrator in prison, and would come into prisons with us because the Forgiveness Project also runs a prison program called Restore, and she would share her story and read out the letters that she had received from the young woman who killed her daughter. And she always said that she wanted to meet this woman. And years down the line, I was contacted by someone who wanted me to put them together, who was actually working in a prison with this woman. And when it came to it, Mary, as the mother was called, couldn't face it.
Okay.
And that was quite interesting to me, because I thought the reality, sometimes you can think you want to.
Yes.
And the reality is very different. And at that time, she couldn't. I saw her actually not long ago, and she said, "I'm ready now."
Okay.
But the time has kind of passed now, because there's no contact anymore.
Yeah.
So these things happen. And you know, Margot's story is very interesting because it was such a chance thing that she came in contact with one of the men who had killed her father. And that turned out, I don't know if she spoke about it, but she certainly has, you know, turned out to be not an easy relationship.
No.
And the same with Joe Berry and Patrick McGee. That is, while they continue to speak and have done over 300 times, it's never easy. But in a way, in the continuation of the dialogue, progress is made and people's lives are changed by hearing what they have to say about reconciling across their differences.
And Margot, as well, as a big proponent of victim-centered restorative justice and her Sorbonne concept, which I had not heard of before, but it's about seeing the shared humanity, the common humanity, in spite of the horrendous actions, the violent actions that someone might have taken. And she's also, I mean, I haven't discussed forgiveness massively with her, but I would imagine that she'd agree that it's a contentious term and concept.
Yes, she's always very encouraging to me, actually, because she likes the way I frame forgiveness.
Yeah.
But I don't push it. And I think if it becomes an obligation or justification, or to do with coercion, which it can do, it becomes dangerous and it becomes a tyranny. And I think she appreciates that, because she's in the territory of forgiveness.
Yes.
Definitely, she's in the same territory, but I don't think it's a word or a concept that works for her.
Yeah.
And therefore, I find that interesting and important story to tell as well. And I actually would just like to say, Jane, I was thinking as we were talking about a woman who I mentioned in my book, who was the victim of a rape and who had come to the conclusion that while she could understand the benefits of forgiving, and in some ways would have been up for it, in terms of she felt it was something that would have helped her personally, she wasn't going to forgive, because she felt in order to forgive, she might be seen to be speaking for all the other women who had also been victims of sexual assault. and therefore in some way condoning or suggesting that people should forgive. And she saw it as unhelpful in that respect. So I thought that was interesting as well.
It's very interesting. And of course, like violence is violence, and if there's a death or just a huge loss of safety involved in sexual violence and rape, but people do not respond in the same way, and they have different supports. Of course, their experience is their own. So I can see how someone would be very reluctant to become a mouthpiece for other victims or survivors. That's really, really interesting and an important point. Dr. Karen Traceman, who is a developmental psychologist and does a lot of trauma training, she's a phrase that I like and use a lot about how relational rupture requires relational repair. And you mentioned earlier on apologies, you know, so how important is it for a victim of some sort of interpersonal injustice or violence to receive a heartfelt apology before they can forgive? Or does it again depend on the person, because it might never be forthcoming, an apology might never be on the table? But for some people, do they need to hear those words, "I'm sorry," before they can actually open themselves up to forgiveness?
Yes. For some people, it's definitely forgiveness is on the table, but it's conditional upon an apology. And Father Michael Lapsley, whose story I share in the book, is a very good example of that. He's a deeply compassionate, he's a priest actually. So, you know, forgiveness is in his lexicon very much. He lost both his arms in the when the apartheid state sent his hands, I should say, lost both hands. Goodness. And he now has prosthetic hands, and he, you know, is brilliant, able to do almost everything. But this was sent by the apartheid government in South Africa. And he says forgiveness is not possible yet because the person hasn't come forward. And he said then it would be so possible. He's ready for it. He would like it, but the person, he doesn't know who did it. He said, until I know who sent me this bomb,
person.
Yeah, or was behind the sending of the bomb, how can I forgive? And he said, and he also says, and even if they did appear at the door and said, I was the one who did it, I'm sorry. He said, I need reparations as well. I've had to pay for carers to help me through the years and other things to help me get through. So others would say that's not always possible. The person is either incapable of remorse and apology, is dead, or unwilling. And if you're waiting, you're still inextricably tied to the perpetrator, or the person who's harmed you. And therefore you're stuck in that relationship, which you don't want. And therefore forgiveness is about severing the ties. And it's about an act of self-preservation and self-healing. And it's entirely unconditional. But what I've observed really is that when people do experience genuine remorse, it's incredibly healing, because that person who's harmed you is now sort of standing in their shame. They're taking accountability. They're being, if it's genuine, humble. They may be feeling humiliated. They're taking ownership and accountability. And in a way, you're handing over your pain to them to hold. And sometimes it leads to, you know, reconciliation and ongoing relationship, or a renewed relationship. And sometimes it's a one-off event and it's happened. And some would say that's easy forgiveness as well. Because actually to have a sincere apology, it's very hard as human beings not to be moved by that.
Yeah.
Of course, it depends really what's happened. But, you know, I think, but others would say forgiveness without an apology is incomplete forgiveness. And I've been told that that's easy forgiveness, incomplete forgiveness, because there's no relationship. So anyway, as you can see, it's varied and diverse.
And just to ask you a bit more about your prison work, because that's kind of my research background is looking at offending behavior and mainly on the male side of things. But I'm also interested in trauma and trauma healing and restorative practice and restorative justice. So what is your kind of view on bringing initiatives safely into prisons? Like, for example, as well, sometimes you can't meet the perpetrator or you're too afraid to meet that person, but you might like to meet someone who committed something similar. And I know of there's a lady who was raped in her teens, who subsequently went through a restorative kind of encounter with a man who committed a similar offense but wasn't the exact perpetrator, but they still connected, and they embraced and they shared their feelings, the whole range of them. Like, can that kind of complicated, delicate work be done safely in prisons?
Yeah. Well, what you've described is actually very similar to the Restore program.
Okay.
Which started off being called the Forgiveness Project's prison program, but we changed it because, again, forgiveness was a tricky word. People thought we were a religious outfit and there to help them forgive or forgive themselves, be forgiven. So, but we started out by taking an ex-offender. Sometimes we'd met through the process of working in prisons, who'd then come out and came to work with us, and taking in also a victim stroke survivor. These labels are difficult, but they're shorthand, to go in and share their story. And it was all around storytelling, and it was a group process, and it was about prisoners, and we worked mainly with in the male estate to start with, would share their stories and do lifelines, and then work in small groups, and we'd show films, and we would discuss forgiveness, but it was really more about them looking at their lives and seeing that there were other ways of dealing with violence. And that then became something slightly different when we started working in the female prisons. I at that point, as I've said, I'm no longer so connected with the Forgiveness Project. I was no longer running the prison program. But the woman, Sandra Barefoot, who I work with, developed a brilliant program for women because she's very creative. She brought in poetry and art, and she realized that women took longer to trust you. But once they opened up, it was phenomenal, the work that we did, and it was very well researched as well. And we're still doing it, but it's become more difficult. If you know anything about prisons, especially after the pandemic, it's harder to get into
getting
prison.
getting access.
But a lot of what we did was creating a safe space, because at the beginning we took a few risks, as new organizations often do, and realized that it needs to have a lot of time. It was very time intensive to be a safe program, and that was another of the problems. Therefore, if it's resource time intensive, it's going to cost a lot, and people aren't prepared to pay it. And that makes me very sad, actually, because these restorative initiatives, I think, are absolutely key to getting people to change behavior and to bring down crime. Because prisons fail in their key objective, which is to lessen crime.
Absolutely true. And I share your frustration with the wanting transformational results after, a very short surface level intervention that maybe doesn't go near the perpetrator's own trauma and need for healing, that kind of just finger points and says, where's your empathy for your victim? And, can you not make better choices?
That's right.
you know, so that there needs to be more kind of honesty. And certainly restorative justice is much more on the rise now in Ireland, and as well looking at the higher level offences like homicides or sexual violence, or even domestic violence, but managing it is tricky. And where there's been a relationship of coercive control, then the space could easily be perhaps warped, you know. So there are concerns, of course, as well over not doing further harm to people who've already been harmed. You've already shared quite a few lovely stories and that show really the difficulties and challenges, as well as the benefits of embarking upon forgiveness. Do you have any particularly favorite story yourself, or one that really resonated with you as you were compiling them, that you'd like to share, Marina?
Well, because I was a journalist, many of the stories were quite already out there in the public domain, quite what I might call big stories to do with terrorism and violence and crime and political upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
But then in time, I also wanted to collect stories to do with families and relationships. And so in the book particularly, I wanted to bring that in because I want to make it relevant to readers, you know. So there's a chapter on personal forgiveness and a chapter on self-forgiveness. So one of the ones that really moves me actually is a young man called Matthew Shirker from America, who came out to his father's gay when he was 16. And his father, who loved him and he loved his father, was a devout Jew and didn't like it, and decided he should have conversion therapy and paid for it. And for 2 years he had this terrible conversion therapy in which he was living in the house with his mother and sisters, and he wasn't allowed to talk to them. That was part of the therapy. You're not, you know, go down to breakfast, don't touch, don't talk. For 2 years he tried to do this, and he tried desperately, and the mother was very confused by it, and she was trying, and it caused enormous damage, as you can imagine. 2 years later, Matthew decided he was going to embrace his sexuality. He was a homosexual, and he told his father that's how he's going to live his life. But a lot of damage had been caused, and there was a complete rupture. He didn't see his father for several years. There was some court case, the parents divorced. There was some court case in which he took the side of the mother. And then he does some therapy and comes to the conclusion that he has to reach out to his father, has to forgive his father for all this great damage done to him. And he buys a ticket. His father by now is living in Israel. I think he lets him know that he's coming, but he buys the ticket and says, I'm coming. And he's ready for the conversations in the past had all been about his father trying to persuade him not to be gay, you know. But can I just read what he says, actually? Because I think,
yes, please.
I think it would be better than me paraphrasing. So he's in Israel, and he says, again, they had dinner, and then his father brings up the subject again. Are you still gay? He said he rambled on for 10 minutes, giving the same speech I'd heard so often. For the first time, I could see he was begging me to save my life. In the past, I'd always perceived him as this horrible man who didn't understand or care for me. But now I just saw a father who loved his son. So I kept calm, and when he'd finished, I hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. Then I looked him in the eye and said, don't worry, Dad. There's nothing to worry about. I know what the world is and who I am, and I promise you, I will take it as it comes, and I will live a beautiful life. My father looked at me, stunned, and then just said, okay. And from that, a beautiful new relationship was formed, and they're now extremely close again. And that was part of forgiveness, is about changing your perspective.
Yes.
Matthew changed his perspective about his father, which enabled his father to change his perspective about his son.
Well, it was certainly lovely that they came to that space for both of them, because just the damage that was wrought along the way by that very fixed position. And of course, with just that topic and that issue, I guess religion can really inflame, and the belief, like if you believe someone is going to go to hell. And we've recently had a scandal in Ireland where a priest said that our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and other gay politicians were going to go to hell if they didn't renounce their practices and this nonsense. But if people genuinely believe those things, I suppose, like as a father, that could be what you're thinking about when you're having that unhelpful rambling on conversation, you know. But thank you for sharing that story, because it's very real. It's very still out there, you know. Conversion therapy is still being proposed to people, and does untold damage and harm.
And also I think not just with that quite extreme sort of family story, but families are falling out with each other all the time. I mean, I've lost count of the number of people I know who aren't speaking to somebody, or someone isn't speaking to them for something they've done or haven't done. And very often, you know, people are ghosted, or communication is shut down, and people don't understand why, because people just aren't willing to have that conversation and just to be a little bit flexible. Because I think forgiveness is all about having flexible thinking and not being stuck in the black and white.
Yes, and having a heart-to-heart connection with someone that might have done you great harm. But as you were saying it there, with the families that are disconnected and not communicating, the other thing is trauma of various sorts is very widespread, you know, and people do harm one another a lot within family dynamics, and sometimes they can't handle it anymore, and to preserve themselves have to break away for a while. But of course, again, real healing probably involves actually expressing what's in your heart and mind and how you've experienced something, rather than maybe compartmentalizing and never vocalizing it, you know. But it's not always easy either, you know. People can be terrified of shifting the relational dynamic as well if there has been a close but unhealthy kind of bond.
I just always quite like what Desmond Tutu once said. He said, you know, forgiveness, you can release a relationship or renew a relationship, and forgive in both cases. So I think it is important to recognize that some relationships have to be released. They're too damaging, but it doesn't mean to say you have to hold on to the hate.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that's very, again, relevant in the context of childhood trauma at the hands of parents or whatever, or siblings, that sometimes you might not be able to healthily live your life and have proximity to people. But that doesn't mean you need to feed your rage constantly either. My final question for you, Marina, I normally ask people about how we can, you know, foster safe, healthy childhoods, particularly what politicians and policymakers can do. But I'd like to ask you, what can they do, and what can we all do really, but especially those with decision-making power, to promote a culture of connection and forgiveness rather than disconnection, condemnation, and vengeance?
I think, well, I would say that we're living in very difficult times where the public discourse is vehement and full of abrasive and bitter dialogue. I was thinking, I think, you know, what you could describe as the new communications technology, the internet, has sort of bent all of our lives out of shape. And I think politicians and policymakers really are caught up in that. Hardened positions so often turn into ideology. And and people across when they're giving their messages out, because people receive information now through the internet very often, and people just give their opinions. There's very little room for dialogue and debate and conversation. It's people talking across each other all the time. So because I believe in the power of story, I think that's what gets through to people.
Yes.
And I think that's what our policymakers, rather than putting out facts and opinions, and to share, and I would say share restorative narratives, because stories can harm, they can fan the flames of prejudice and normalize hate. Not all stories are good, but the fact that they can do that shows how powerful they are.
Yes.
So if you pick the right stories to tell, you could transcend division and intolerance. And I think there needs to be more of a dialogue around hope. There needs to be more of a dialogue which focuses on compassion, empathy, forgiveness, because so often it's about division, insularity, and looking inwards. So that's really my greatest desire, is that people find the stories to tell that can create a more compassionate world.
Thank you so much, Marina. That's a lovely place to finish up, I think. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. This has been Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, and my wonderful, inspiring guest, who's given me an awful lot to think about, and hopefully you too, has been Marina Cantacuzino. Thanks again, Marina, for sharing your work and your mission with me.
Thank you, Jane.